We are going to wrap up our series this weekend on Lazarus. And our focus has been, since Easter, on the work of spiritual transformation and how we are transformed by Jesus. And maybe along the way, we've spent a long time looking at the story of Lazarus. Maybe you've asked yourself or wondered, well, what happened after Jesus called him out of the tomb and brought him back to life? Like, did he live for a good long while? Did he die? We know that the Jewish leaders were trying to kill him like they killed Jesus. And so maybe you wondered, what happened next? In Scripture, we actually don't have a lot of detail on the life of Lazarus after the events of John 11 and John 12, which we'll explore a little bit more here in just a moment. But if you were to go to the island of Cyprus, and if you were to visit a church dedicated to Lazarus and go down to the basement, you would find this empty tomb, right? And this is the location where, according to some tradition, Lazarus, after he lived another 30 years, was finally laid to rest again. The church is a beautiful structure. Again, look at it on the Isle of Cyprus. You can see there on the Google Map screenshot I took. It's just off of the coast of Israel and Lebanon in the Mediterranean Sea. And according to one tradition in church history, in the weeks after the events of Jesus' death and resurrection, as persecution began to be directed at the believers in Jerusalem, Mary and Martha and Lazarus were sent off to Cyprus for their safety. And while they were there, Paul and Barnabas visited on their first missionary journey and appointed Lazarus as the first bishop of the church in Cyprus. And so one tradition is that he lived for about another 30 years and then finished his life there on the Isle of Cyprus. But if you're of the more French persuasion or part of the Western Church instead of the Eastern Orthodox Church, you would be convinced that he actually didn't go to Cyprus. He went to Marseille in the southern coast of France, and he was the bishop there instead of in Cyprus, and his body was buried up a little further north in this beautiful church in the French town of Autun. So we have two different competing stories, two sets of bones that allegedly belong to Lazarus, and honestly, we're not really 100% sure which one is the actual burial place and the body of Lazarus. It seems a little more convincing to me that Cyprus is probably the one, but that's the way it goes with some of the early church traditions. One thing that is common in all the stories about Lazarus and the depictions of him is that he is portrayed as wrapped up in his grave clothes. So, for example, this is a depiction of Lazarus in the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, which is the largest church building in the Catholic Church in the United States. It's located in Washington, D.C., just a little bit northeast of the U.S. Capitol, a couple miles away. A beautiful building, ornate, lots of mosaic, and this is the depiction of Lazarus. And the reason that he is often depicted this way is because of this little detail. Pastor Randy covered this a few weeks ago, but let me take you back there to get started today. The moment that Lazarus came out of the tomb. Okay? So Jesus is standing there outside the tomb of his friend, and he shouts out, loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man, John tells us, came out, his hands and his feet bound in grave clothes, and his face wrapped in a headcloth. And then, John tells us, Jesus told them, presumably Mary and Martha, maybe their friends, the people who had gathered to grieve with them, he told them, the community gathered around the tomb, unwrap him and let him go. And we didn't spend a lot of time on this a few weeks ago, but maybe you were wondering, well, why did Jesus go about the miracle this way? Like, it seems kind of weird for Lazarus to come shuffling out of the tomb kind of mummy-like, right? Kind of tied up still. Why didn't Jesus just say, "Lazarus, come forth," and just dissolve the fabric and whatever was binding him and have him come out strong and healthy and happy and all of that? Well, one of the reasons could be that Jesus wanted Lazarus to experience the work of his transformation in the context of community. This depiction of Lazarus wrapped up in his clothes, it's been in our cover art for this series. This is by Giotto, the Renaissance artist. You see Lazarus coming out there in his grave clothes, and you see all the people who were included in the painting around him. Here's another artist rendition. This is Mattia Preti from the 1600s. And you see Lazarus there, still bound at his ankles as Jesus is standing nearby, and the community around him participating in the process of his transformation from dead and decaying in the tomb to alive and well again as someone who has been transformed and restored. Maybe you have experienced the benefits of Christian community already in your life. Whether you followed Jesus for just a little while or your whole life, maybe you've had friends rally around you when you've gone through a health crisis. Or maybe when you brought a new child home from the hospital, you had people with a meal train show up and bring you more pasta than you could possibly consume in one day. And so you had a freezer full left over, right? Or maybe you participated on the other side of that, and you've rallied around people to help take good care of them. At its best, Christian community surrounds women and men and girls and boys in the highs and the lows in life to make them know for sure they are not alone, but they are united in community with fellow believers as they journey through life. Part of the reason I think Jesus invited the community around Lazarus to help him untie his grave clothes was to remind us of the importance of Christian community. Stephen Smith, author of the book The Lazarus Life, that's been one of the inspirations for this series, he says it this way: friends cannot take the place of Jesus. Right? Friends are super important. They cannot take the place of Jesus. That is, they can't die on the cross and pay for your sins. Right? They don't have the power to set you free from sin and darkness and all of its ill effects. Friends don't replace Jesus, but Jesus doesn't do what the community of God is supposed to. Jesus could have had Lazarus come out alive and well and set free from his grave clothes, but instead he chooses to invite the community around him to participate in his life of transformation. If you've experienced the good sides of Christian community, you may also have experienced that if you stay around the church for very long or hang out with people who say they're Christians for a little while, you'll discover there still is some dark and stinky and maybe even rotten places not far under the surface. That is to say, sometimes the friends you thought you could count on, they don't show up when you need them. Or sometimes when you're revealing whatever it is that you're carrying, you're getting real and honest with somebody, and you're disclosing some past hurt and pain, maybe some shame, maybe some trauma that you've experienced. It's just too much. They shut down, they try to change the subject, and they don't dwell with you in the midst of the hurt. Maybe you've experienced the fact that Christians are still sinners who need God's grace and healing. Sometimes they will disappoint you and let you down. So if both of those are true, that sometimes you've experienced Christian community at its best, but you've also seen that we're still a bunch of weary sinners on our way towards a life transformed by Jesus, what can we do from this experience? What can we learn from the story of Lazarus? What can we learn from what God's Word says? To help answer that today, let me show you an example of what Paul describes as an ideal for Christian community. This is from Philippians chapter 2. It's from the Message translation. It's a devotional version of the Bible, so it's a little different from most of our translations, but notice what he says. If you've gotten anything at all out of following Christ, if his love has made any difference in your life, if being in a community of the Spirit means anything to you, if you have a heart, if you care, then do me a favor. Agree with each other, love each other, be deep-spirited friends. Don't push your way to the front. Don't sweet-talk your way to the top. Put yourself aside and help others instead. Don't be obsessed with getting your own advantage, but instead, forget yourselves long enough to lend a helping hand. Isn't that a beautiful picture? Or if you just imagine, what if everyone that you know, everyone in your circle of family and friends, actually lived out and embodied God's best for you, like Paul describes here, putting others first, being eager to lend a helping hand, being humble and selfless. If we're honest, all of us fall short at some point of this ideal, but we long for it because we were created for it, to experience the best of Christian community as we live out our lives following Jesus and experience the transformation that God calls us to. So if that's what we're aiming towards, how can we get there? To answer that, I'd like to unpack for you a little bit what transformational community is supposed to look like as followers of Jesus. Right? It's essential for the ongoing work of spiritual transformation. Just like Lazarus needed help to get out of his grave clothes, we do too. So transformational community is first and foremost a safe community. That is to say, at its best, God's people agreeing to say, no matter what you say, I will love you, care for you, and stay with you through the hard times as well as to celebrate with you in the high times. Now, there's an interesting story from the Old Testament that kind of relates to this. It's a story from the book of 2 Kings, where the people of God in Israel, as it was called in that day, the northern tribes of Israel, they were besieged and in their capital city, and it had gotten so bad, in fact, that they were willing to eat anything and everything, and even had resorted to cannibalism in order to survive. So pretty bad, right? Life at its worst. In the midst of that, there's this interesting description of what the king at that time does. It says this: when the king heard this, he tore his clothes in despair. And as the king walked around the wall, imagine like a wall around the fortified city, the people could see that he was wearing burlap under his robe next to his skin. The picture we get here is that the king, for some time during this siege, had been wearing burlap underneath his kingly robes. So on the outside, he looked all presentable and dignified, but hidden, he was hurting and he was grieving. How about that for some thematic thunder, right? For his people. And the sense we get here is he wasn't willing to let others know how worried he was. It wasn't safe for him in his city at that time to show others how deeply concerned he was for the future and the well-being of his people. Christian community that is transformational has to be a safe place where we can be honest with ourselves and others about whatever it is that we are carrying, whatever burdens we need to have lifted. So transformational community is first and foremost, at its best, a safe space. And it's also a place where we can share our stories. You know, one thing I've observed about Christians is we are often very good at accumulating information about God or about the Bible. We're very good at spelling out and articulating what it is we believe and teach. And that's very important. So don't hear what I'm not saying. Very, very important. But one thing maybe you've observed is that having all the right information in your head doesn't necessarily mean you actually change how you live and behave. Sometimes the information doesn't transfer over to life change. And the way that it can and should is when you can connect whatever it is you're learning and hearing from God to what it is you're thinking and feeling, what you're experiencing in life. And the way that God invites us to do that is by sharing our stories, telling about our hurts, our pains, our hopes, and our dreams, and hearing others and what they have to say as well. When we do get vulnerable in a safe place and tell our stories and hear others, it's essential that we do so like Jesus, John chapter 1, verse 14, full of grace and truth. Right? Jesus demonstrates fully what the presence of God in this world can look like. He is the fullness of deity now in bodily form, and when he comes, he hears the hurt and the pain. He confronts sin where it is needed, but he always does so full of grace and truth, and invites us as people of grace to do the same. One of the ways in which we can create that grace-filled environment is through the practice of hospitality. And I know some of you in the room, you have the spiritual gift of hospitality. You can set out a spread, you can welcome people into your home, and you can delight them with delicious and beautiful things, and it's fantastic. Some of you think to yourself, the last place I want people is in my house because it's my sanctuary, and honestly, I don't keep it clean because it stresses me out to try to put everything in its place, and so you think about this and you're like, well, I'm out. I can't ever show hospitality. But the hospitality we're talking about isn't just opening your home and inviting people into it. It could also be at a coffee shop, across a workplace conference table, or a classroom desk. Because this is what we mean when we're talking about hospitality. Henry Nouwen, a great spiritual writer, says in his book, Reaching Out, hospitality is not to change people, but to offer them space where change can take place. So regardless of where you are, whether in your home or somewhere else in the community, you can create a welcoming, trusting, safe environment where they can be honest and vulnerable about what they are carrying and allow Jesus to enter in to do his work of transformation. Finally, the fifth aspect of what transformational community should look like is one in which we practice acceptance. Now, sometimes that word acceptance can be a little trigger word, so let me unpack what I mean by it. We'll take a look at it from Romans chapter 15. These words. He says, may God, who gives this patience and encouragement, help you live in complete harmony with each other. See that theme of community together? As is fitting for the followers of Jesus. Then all of you can join together with one voice and, in verse 7, accept each other just as Christ has accepted you, so that God will be given glory. And how is it, just to be clear, that God has accepted you? He doesn't look at you and your sin and your shame and say, don't worry about it, not a big deal. Quite the opposite. He acknowledges the reality of your sin, but he takes it upon himself. He deals with it. He offers you grace, mercy, and forgiveness. And then when he looks at you again, he says, I don't see you because of your sin or as being defined by it. Instead, I see you as a dearly loved child of God, made in my image, for whom I have died, so that you can be set free. And then he invites you to assume that same posture. Whoever is in your circle of life and influence, he invites you to say, first and foremost, you are a child of God, loved by him, made in his image, with whom he desires to have a deep and abiding relationship. And so I choose to start there too. Later on, you might have to deal with some sin conditions and speak truth into it. But starting from that posture of grace, you identify them first as God sees them first. Now, let's take a look at how that concept of transformational community plays itself out in the story of Lazarus and his friends. That brings us to chapter 12, verse 1, where what we see Jesus do is enter into community and hospitality with his friends. 6 days before the Passover, John tells us, Jesus arrived in Bethany, the home of Lazarus, the man he had raised from the dead. Now, this Passover, by the way, was Good Friday, the day that Jesus was crucified. So within a week of his own death, what do we see Jesus prioritizing? Time in community with his friends. A dinner was prepared in Jesus' honor. Martha served, as she always does, and Lazarus was among those who ate with him. We see Lazarus laying there. In fact, what they do is they lay on one side on a couch with a low set table. They'd probably lean on their left hand and eat with their right hand, their feet kind of out around the perimeter of whatever that circle would have been. And you wonder to yourself, if you were Lazarus, the 4 days dead, just rescued from his tomb and decay, like how do you thank Jesus for what he did? Like if you're Mary and Martha, they had hoped Jesus would come and rescue their brother, and he did. How do you say thank you for something like that? And there's nothing materially that you could offer Jesus, but what they did give him is what they had, their time, their hospitality, their relationship, and Jesus happily accepted it. Because what Jesus ultimately desires is a deep and abiding relationship with us. Stephen Smith says it this way: intimacy with Jesus is the mark of a transformed life. He's never too hurried or too busy or too important to spend time with his friends. But what's interesting is often for us, busyness can be a distraction from a deeper relationship with Jesus. Think about it this way. Oswald Chambers, maybe you know the book, My Utmost for His Highest. He says the greatest competitor to our devotion to Jesus Christ is our service for Him. Now, we just had Karen talk about how important serving is, so don't hear what I'm not saying here either. Volunteering, serving, giving of our time and energy, being busy in spiritual practices, essential to a Christian life. But it's not all that the Christian life is supposed to be. They're tools or vehicles to lead us to what matters most, and that is a deep and abiding relationship with Jesus. Jesus is never too busy or in too much of a hurry to spend time with His friends. And what He invites you into as well is a deeper relationship with Him. Because without times of joyful intimacy with Jesus, we'll lose our way on what is a long path of transformation. So Jesus says, Lazarus, come out of the tomb. He invites his community to help him in his work of transformation, and that he's not too hurried to spend time with his friends. Notice then, finally, how they respond. Mary took a 12-ounce jar of expensive perfume made from the essence of nard. That was from all the way in India, by the way. And she anointed Jesus' feet with it, wiping his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of it. From Judas's objection, we know this was a very expensive form of perfume, right? It's not like the cologne I get from Five Below or one of the other places that's just as cheap as I can get away with. Like, this was worth a full year's wages, but she was glad to lavish her thanks upon Jesus, and here's why. Gratitude marks a transformed life. When you experience a change like Mary and Martha and Lazarus, when you, as followers of Jesus today, experience His breakthrough, His peace, and His provision, and it's beyond your ability to acquire or manufacture it on your own, the posture of humility and gratitude we see in Mary and the others is all we have to offer. But it's also all that Jesus desires. A broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. But that heart, broken and restored by Jesus, always leads to an overflow of gratitude and thanks. So as we close today, focusing on the power of Christian community, the need for intimacy that leads to gratitude and generosity, here's a couple things I'd like you to consider during our Hear and Practice time. We'll have Jason bring up the music for a few minutes, then we'll go grab our kids so we can celebrate our God sightings. But before we do that, spend some time in this space and answer these questions. When have you experienced transformational community? And how would you describe the difference it made to somebody else? And then secondly, how might you be able to pursue greater intimacy with Jesus this summer? Take a few moments, reflect on that, and then we'll close out with our God sightings and our final blessing.